Hello there, I'm Allie and welcome to my channel. Today's video is the fifth and final installment in my series documenting the making of an 1860s inspired version of Ariel's pink ball gown from Disney's The Little Mermaid. We have been working on this project from the skin out. So far we have made a chemise, bloomers, a corset, a hoop skirt, a petticoat, and 2 gown skirts. Whew! It's been a lot. Today, finally, it is time for the last piece of this gown, the bodice. Links to materials and patterns will be in the description down below. Let's get into it. I used the same matte satin and dusty rose from Fabric Wholesale direct from the underskirt for the bodice and pattern 0704 from past patterns on Etsy. I cut everything out with my rotary cutter and transferred pattern markings to the fabric with my chalk pencil. I drafted my own pattern for the puff sleeves to have that contrasting slash effect. I traced around the sleeve piece that came with the pattern on a separate piece of paper, then decided where I wanted the slashes to be and cut my pattern at those locations. Then added about 2 inches to the bottom and 1/2 inch of seam allowance to the sides of each cut piece. I cut these custom drafted pattern pieces in the same color satin as the rest of the bodice. All the bodice pieces were also cut from a white cotton muslin for the lining. The sleeve lining was cut using the pattern piece that came with the pattern. The sleeve lining is actually quite a bit smaller than the outside, and you'll see why when I assemble the sleeve. To flatline the bodice pieces, I lined up the lining and satin with wrong sides together and clipped around the edges to secure them. I basted around each piece, then serged the edges to finish them. Starting with the center front, I began assembling the bodice. I made sure to thoroughly press each seam as I went. When I'm pinning a curved seam like the side front pieces, I like to first line up any registration marks, then the top, the bottom, and then ease the rest of the seam into place. I also tend to place my pins perpendicular to the seam so I can sew over my pins to keep the seam secure while sewing. I find this method gives the smoothest result with minimal to no puckering. The side back seam was tricky to get just right. To get the angle crisp and perfect, I started with the top short part of the seam, sewing just from the edge to the X I drew on the registration mark for the point. I backstitched at the X, then clipped the seam as close to my threads as possible without cutting the seam. I was able to then match the registration marks and ease the rest of the seam into place. I stitched the rest of the seam, starting at the X and working my way down to the bottom. I pressed the seam open, then toward the center back piece, then ran downstairs to excitedly show my husband how good the seam looked. He didn't really understand my excitement at first, but he was supportive and hyped me up anyway. I did 2 lines of top stitching to secure that seam allowance down, then attached the front and back of the bodice at the side seam. Once the side seam was sewn and pressed, I did the shoulder seams. Then it was onto the sleeves. I cut and serged some 3-inch by 11-inch strips of the light pink satin I used for the underskirt and laid all my pieces out in order. Working from one side to the other, I pinned and sewed one piece at a time. Once that was all sewn together, I top stitched along the seam to keep the folded edge crisp, then pleated the pieces so the darker edges would come together. I basted those pleats in place, then trimmed off the excess bits of light pink fabric at the top of each pleat. Next, I ran a basting stitch along each side so I could gather the larger satin piece to fit on the muslin lining. I pinned the satin layer to the lining at the top first, then pulled on the basting threads to gather it down, pinned the bottom, and stitched around the edges by machine. Because the satin layer is longer than the muslin lining, the gathers encourage it to naturally form a puffed sleeve that holds its shape. Next, I had to make a ton of piping, so I cut a bunch of 2-inch wide strips from my light pink satin, turned on an episode of Grey's Anatomy, and locked into sew piping forever. Okay, that was dramatic. It wasn't forever, and I actually found the process quite zen and satisfying. I made 2 kinds of piping, some smaller made with 1.5mm cotton cord for the sleeve cuff, and some larger with 5mm cord for the neckline, waist, and everywhere else. I folded the fabric strips around the cord, then stitched along the encased cord with my zipper foot. Once they were all sewn, I pinked the edges of the fabric so it wouldn't fray while I handled it. I started with the smaller piping on the fitted sleeve. With right sides together, I pinned it to just one side of the pointed hem and sewed that down by machine with my zipper foot, stitching right on top of the stitch line from the piping. I stitched from the edge to the point, then stopped. Clipped the piping case at the point, then eased it into place before continuing to sew on the other side. This creates the sharpest possible corner when I turn the hem. I clipped a notch in the corner to allow it to fold under, then serged the piping and sleeve together. I folded the piping case to the inside, then top stitched everything in place. Then it was finally time to assemble the puff and fitted sleeve pieces. With right sides together, I pinned the 2 pieces together and sewed it up. Next, I pinned up the long underarm seam, making sure to match the seam I just did between the puff and the fitted part of the sleeve. After that seam was sewn and pressed, I got into the first of the beading. I decided it would be easier to do most of the sleeve beading and embellishments before attaching the sleeve to the rest of the bodice. Starting the center point of the sleeve hem, I used an 8mm glass pearl bead in the center to emphasize the point, then alternated 6 and 4mm beads around the rest of the hem. I used the same trim from the skirts and corset around the top of the fitted sleeve right under the puff. I initially wanted to use piping here, but it created too much bulk. I attached the trim with whip stitch, then tacked the points down and added a 4mm bead in between each point. Back to the body of the bodice now. I clipped the large piping around the arm side to measure how much I needed. I trimmed it to length with about an inch of overlap for seam allowance. I seam dripped about an inch back, then trimmed the piping cord by 1/2 inch on each side. With right sides together, I sewed the ends of the piping case together, trimmed the seam allowance, then stitched the piping back in the case. This creates a continuous ring of piping. I matched the seam on the piping to the side seam and clipped the piping back to the arm side. I found it easier to attach the piping securely before putting the sleeve on, so there was no need to worry about it getting sewn on wonky and having to rip it off and redo it. I again sewed right on top of the stitch line already on the piping to make sure it was flush as possible. Then it was time to attach the sleeves. If you look very carefully in the top right of the frame, you can almost make out that I'm clipping the sleeve to the arm side, with the underarm seam and the sleeve seam matched. I attached the boning channels to the 3 front seams next by carefully top stitching some muslin bias tape to the seam allowances. I gave those a good press, then whip stitched the seam allowance to just the lining layer. This keeps everything flat and in place. I started with the piping on the bottom of the bodice because I knew it would be trickier and I wanted to get it out of the way. The way I stitched on the piping to the top and bottom is actually wrong, but we'll get into that and the issues it caused later. Once I had the piping attached to the bodice, I serged the edges together. I cut a triangle out of the piping case and the bodice at the bottom center front point to reduce unnecessary bulk when I folded under. With some embroidery floss, I overcast those raw edges by hand. I cut my lengths of spiral steel boning down to the correct lengths and added boning tips, which is my least favorite part of using boning no matter what I'm making. After I was done pinching myself, I slid each bone into its respective casing. With the boning in, I stitched the top piping on, just like the bottom, and serged the edges together. Then it was time for a bunch of hand sewing in front of the TV, which is why this lighting sucks. I whip stitched the edge to the lining on the inside to keep it down without visible top stitching. I folded the center back in by about an inch as marked on the pattern and sewed the center back boning channel. Then I made the bust pads. Each pad is just 2 layers of muslin and 2 layers of cotton batting. I sewed around the outer edge of the muslin with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, then trimmed the seam allowance down with my pinking shears, and no, I did not change my thread to match. I pressed that piece flat, turned it right side out, and pressed it again. For the batting, I cut it with the same pattern as the muslin, based it about 5/8 of an inch from the edge, then trim the excess off as close to the stitch line as possible. This makes it easy to settle in the muslin case without any weird bulk. I inserted the batting, then top stitched around the opening at the top and serged the edge to finish it. It would have made the most sense to attach the bust pad then, but no, I wanted to bead. This step was one I looked forward to most, adding the beads to the puff sleeves. I anchored my thread in the top of the sleeve, then strung 6, 8, and 10mm glass pearl beads until it was as long as the seam. Once it was long enough, I anchored the threads at the bottom of the puff, then couched the strand of beads down. Only after I added over 200 beads to each sleeve, and the weight that comes with it that I attached the bust pad to the underarm seam at the points marked on the pattern. I definitely should have done this first, because the weight of the beads pulling the bodice all over the place was really annoying. Okay, so here's the deal. There was quite a bit that I did between the last clip you just saw and the next one, but apparently I didn't film any of it. Oops. So to sum up, I added some of the same trim that I use in the skirts and the sleeves and all that along the neckline, hand stitched it down, all that fun jazz, and then played around with beading to decide how I wanted to bead the neckline. I also procrastinated putting a closure in the bodice for a while because I was so afraid that I would goof up the bodice that I already made twice by messing up the lacing holes that I decided rather than do that, I would scour the internet for literally any other example of a bodice closing with something other than lacing in the 1860s. I found one, exactly one, instance where they closed a ball gown bodice with hooks and eyes, and that was enough for me. So hook and eye tape it was. And boy, am I glad that I did not put lacing in the back of this bodice because, well, play the clip. Okay, so we have a problem. We've got this beautiful bodice, right? You know, we've got the fancy beading on the neckline. You know, we've got beautiful beading on the sleeves and stuff. This is the bodice on my dress form. I have just gotten it done enough to the point where I just put the closure in of the hook and eye tape in the back. This is all, you know, laced up on my mannequin. And tell me if you can see the problem here. It's too big. And it's not too big by like a little bit. It's too big by a lot. It's too big by nearly 2 inches. And I just put this on, you know, with all of the foundation layers, both skirts, all of that, because I've been putting this bodice on my dress form and seeing this like gaping here and being like, oh, that's weird. You know, why is it like that? And like I've measured the waist of my dress form to make sure that that is, you know, correct with my waist measurement when I'm in my corset, all of that stuff. Yeah, Gucci, she Gucci. The issue is at the beginning of the year, it is March now. I made a New Year's resolution to myself to eat healthier, exercise more, and that has caused me to lose about 10 pounds since January. And I've lost a little bit more in my waist than I thought I did. And I think some of this may be like bias stretching and stuff from pressing it. I'm really not entirely sure, but the bodice is like 2 inches too big. So what I'm gonna have to do is I am going to have to, the hook and eye tape out of this that runs down the center, which I guess isn't the end of the world because now I'm looking at it and I'm realizing that it's like a little bit crooked, which I just spent, I can't tell you how long backstitching by hand into this and skipping over the little hooks and loops. Ugh. But I am also gonna have to take the piping off the top and bottom of the bodice. I'm gonna have to probably cut back one of these little lacy pattern doodads and take the boning and the boning channel out of there. Seam rip, you know, my seam ripper and I are gonna be good friends for a minute. And I'm going to have to fold this back by like a good inch almost at the hem. I might seam rip the bottom back to this side seam here, and I may take some of the waist out of the side seam instead of taking it all out of the back, because the top actually fits pretty good. I can move my shoulders and stuff like that, but the waist is a problem, like a big problem. Like it's bad. It's really bad. It does not look right. You know, I'm too much of a perfectionist. I have too much of a vision of how I want this to look to accept the amount of gaping that is happening in this bodice. So I think what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna rip the piping off the bottom back before the side seams. I'm gonna take the side seams in a little bit, and I'm gonna use my dress form kind of as a guide, because the dress form should have just about my waist measurement when I'm corseted. I'll take the side seams in at the waist a little bit, and then I am going to probably take a 1/2 inch or so out of the center. This is I'm not happy. I'm not happy. Okay, so I literally procrastinated doing this for 2 whole weeks. You can tell because my nails are entirely different than they were. Also, they're really grown out here. You want to really see them up close. I'm getting them done on Sunday with my sister. Anyway, I seam ripped everything. I took the boning out. I've still got this folded over. I'm going to try and avoid having to take anything out of the center back because that involves having to mess with the piping on the top, and I don't want to deal with that. So I pulled all of the piping off back to, I don't know, what is that, 2 inches or so past the side seams on either side. I realized as I was seam ripping all of this off that I had serged together, which I'm certain that there's footage of, but I had forgotten because you guys see these videos in, you know, regular increments, whereas it takes me months to do a project like this because I get frustrated and walk away or whatever. So I had serged the bodice and the piping together, and yeah, that's great. That's fun. So I had to deal with all of that. So I need to get this tailoring and alteration done in one sitting so that I can avoid handling the raw edges that are coming out as much as possible because this fabric fray is really bad. So what I'm going to do is I've already got like this top bit pinned. I'm going to pin the bodice to my dress form. And then what we're going to do is we're going to pinch out all of the excess at the side seams to figure out how much I need to alter that by. It's probably going to be about 1 inch on either side, but we're gonna see and find out. So this is just the joys of costume making. I hate tailoring. I hate having to take things apart and mess with them, but you know, it is what it is. So let's go. Okay, I didn't record any of me actually pinning this out because it would have been really difficult to get a good angle. So I've got this securely pinned all the way down. There is a little bit of a gap here. This is the zipper covered thing for my dress form, whatever. So I securely pinned this all down. It's okay that there's a little bit of a gap here. I'm not super worried about that. That'll all work out. But like, look at this. So the waist of my dress form is about what my natural waist is. So my corset is going to reduce my waist down by a little bit more, but then once you add the bulk of all of the skirt waistbands and stuff, it'll be fine. So I have pinched out a little bit more than 1 inch. No, it's about 1 inch on either side of the seam. So I've pinched out like 2 inches. Well, 1.5-ish because there's a 1/2 inch seam allowance in there. Whatever, math. So I've pinched that out. I've pinned it. Now what I'm going to do, because now I know that I need to take at least this much out of either side seam, I shouldn't have to take anything out of the center back seam, which is great because the shoulders fit fine. I want the shoulders to be loose enough that I can still move my arms up and down, all of that stuff. So that the shoulders are fine. The waist was where the big problem was. So that's all good. I'm not going to be affecting any of this stuff here. When I pressed this, it got all goofy and I can't ungoofy it. So it's fine. It's on the back. It's going to be covered by my wig anyway. So whatever, which my wig arrives today, which is exciting. I'm going to now take this off of my dress form because now I know I need to take these side seams in by 1 inch. I'm going to turn this inside out and trace basically a dart from the underarm seam up under here, wherever, down to the side seam so that I am taking at least that 1 inch out of the waist. Because everything else is pretty good. Look at how much better that looks from the front. Oh my God. So, I am going to take this off my dress form. I am going to sew those side seams. I'm debating whether or not to leave the additional seam allowance on the inside. We will see. We will see. But just, oh my gosh, does that look 1,000,000 times better than it did before. So I'm going to take this off. I'm going to get the side seams all sewn up and we're going to rock and roll. So much better. So much better. The side seams are now set back a little bit farther than they probably should be, but look at that. The difference the difference with the, oh my gosh, that is 10,000 times better. All I did was take in the side seam. So the center back seam is still the same. Now I have to put the piping back on, and I'm actually gonna do it right this time. The correct way to do the piping, according to the instructions, which I did not do when I put the piping on initially, is to actually fold under the center back fold first, then to put the piping on. So I'm going to do so. I think I might unpick just a little bit of this top piping, just a little bit, just to do this correctly, because it creates a lot of bulk on either side of the boning channel, and I don't know how much of my struggle I actually filmed in the process of putting the boning in the boning channel, but there's a lot of bulk right here. You can kind of see that's all from the piping casing. So I cut the piping so that it would stop at the edge of the fold, and so there wouldn't be piping folded under, so it wouldn't be super bulky here. But I didn't take into account that the casing would create so much bulk here. So I am going to unpick just a little bit of this top, just enough to do the casing properly. I am going to stitch the boning channel again for the center back. First I'm gonna unpick the piping, then I'm gonna sew the boning channel, then I'm gonna put the piping on the top and bottom back on, and then we will be almost back to where we started. What time is it? I have probably just enough time before I have to go to work to do the boning channel, and then I will finish later, because I certainly do not have time to do all the serging again and then put the closure back in. But okay, here is how we are redoing the piping casing here. So I folded, doing it according to the directions this time. I folded the center back fold over, redid the boning channel, and now the piping goes on. So what I did is I just cut it down to length. This is on the bottom here. I cut it down to length. I cut the actual piping cord to end, I don't know, like an 1/8 inch-ish, maybe even 1/4 of an inch short of the edge of this, because folding this over adds just a little bit of bulk. I cut the casing to be about 1/2 inch longer than the piping, then with the pinking shears. And then I snipped the corners off just to reduce bulk. So then this gets folded over like this. God, this is hard to do left-handed and one-handed. Fold it like this, fold it in half like that, and then it gets stitched back down. That's really ugly and not perfect, but it's okay. So that gets all stitched down like that. Would you focus? Thank you. Back into like piping, gets sewn back onto the bodice, and then the edges get re-serged together so that nothing frays. It's a little bit tedious, but it actually doesn't take that long. So this is the last one I have to do. I've already done the ones on the top and the one on either side, on the other side of the bottom. So this is the last one I gotta do. With all the goofiness fixed and everything reassembled, I put even more beading on the bottom of the bodice, and finally my 1860s Ariel gown was done. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave me a like, drop a comment, and subscribe if you'd like to see more from me. Don't forget to click the notification bell so YouTube lets you know every time I upload. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!